Welcome back to the AI Daily Brief. Today, we are digging into Andreessen Horowitz's just released Top 100 GenAI consumer apps. Now, this is a study they do about every 6 months. They're on their 5th edition since 2023, and they use data from SimilarWeb and Sense Tower to get a sense of which GenAI apps are getting the most traffic. So this is generally speaking not about revenue, it's about raw usage, which has limitations in terms of a methodology, of course. There are, I believe, some AI apps that have fewer users, but much more usage from a revenue standpoint. But still, especially because they do this every 6 months, it creates a pretty good mechanism to see how things are changing. Now, before we get into this list, if you go back to 6 months ago, in March of this year, there were a few things that were pretty notable from that particular list. The first was that we were still very much in the midst of the DeepSeek moment. You'll remember back in January, DeepSeek launched its app, which was for many people the first time that they had used a reasoning model, which blew a lot of minds. Yes, ChatGPT already had O1, and O1 was at the time better than R1, at least based on a variety of different benchmarks. But O1 was pretty buried behind paid accounts. I think at the time, in fact, it wasn't available at all in the free version of ChatGPT. And so, when consumers had access to this reasoning model, which inherently has some pretty huge advantages over what was available in the free ChatGPT, and it had the fun revealed thought experience where people could actually see how the model was quote-unquote thinking through the problem, it became a bit of a phenomenon. And back then you could see this massive uptick where DeepSeek just raced ahead of Claude, Perplexity, and basically everything but ChatGPT, and even for a time ahead of the ChatGPT app, really making its mark on the industry. Another theme from 6 months ago was that AI video had recently reached a new level of proficiency, placing a bunch of companies on the list as well. The last trend worth noting from that previous edition was that we were just starting to see the vibe coding apps start to take hold. Cursor had just debuted on that list at number 41 in their web rankings, Bolt was at 48, and Lovable was on their Brink list just outside the top 50. So that was the story in March, but what's the story now? We'll get into a bunch of their different conclusions, but I think by and large, what this list feels like to me is a bit of a settling. If you go back through the entire history of these charts, you can often find some really weird or surprising entries on the list. In other words, apps that you've never heard of, somehow being in the top 50 either in web products or in mobile apps. Things feel like they're starting to settle down a little bit, with leaders starting to get more comfortably into their leading role. You see, for example, a higher concentration of the core LLM apps at the top of both of the charts. The top 4 web products, for example, are ChatGPT, Gemini, DeepSeek, and Grok in that order. Next is Character, but then it's Perplexity and Claude. Google has another entry, number 10 at Google AI Studio, and another at 13 with Notebook LM. And then in the top 25, you also have a number of the international LLMs like Dubao, Kimi, Qwen 3, again kind of anchoring themselves there at the top of the list. But before I dig more into my analysis, let's see what A16Z thought was worth noting. First, and this won't surprise you given that I just mentioned a bunch of Google AI properties on that list, their number one trend is Google making big moves. They write, Google saw 4 entrants on the web list. For the first time, were able to rank their traffic and include them independently. Gemini was, as we just mentioned, second place behind ChatGPT, but Google AI Studio, Notebook LM, and Google Labs all made appearances on the list. Now, it is worth noting that although Gemini has risen up to number 2 behind ChatGPT, there is still an absolute chasm between the two. According to this data, Gemini gets about 12% of ChatGPT's visits on the web, so literally just a little over 1/10 of the number 1. It is just incredible how big ChatGPT's first mover advantage was, and the name recognition that has associated them with AI for so many people. Still, Google's ascendancy is really impressive, and the fact that they've got this diversity of products definitely matches the general sentiment that we see right now with Google resurging to a leadership role in the AI space overall. I was interested to see Notebook LM so high, especially given that a lot of the hype wave of that has faded from the end of last year. It certainly suggests that the people who are using it are finding it to be durably valuable, not just a one-off type of intrigue. But still, maybe the most notable to me was that Google Labs, which is their experimental home for new models, actually made the list at number 39. Labs is where you can find things like Project Mariner, which is Google's agentic browser. But the real driver, it appears to be, is their dominant video model VO3. A16Z writes that Google Labs traffic spiked more than 13% following VO3's launch back in May. I think that as VO3 moves out into its own space, you're going to see that do nothing but rise. A16Z's next notable trend is that while Elon might be out there suing Apple and OpenAI for collusion, Grok is in fact making gains when it comes to its place relative to ChatGPT. Grok is now up to number 4 on the web and number 23 on mobile. And as A16Z writes, the company's jump on mobile has been particularly striking, going from a cold start with no app at the end of 2024 to upwards of 20 million monthly active users now. Grok's mobile usage really kicked up in July in the wake of the release of Grok 4, jumping up nearly 40%. That said, it looks like from the numbers that at least some meaningful part of that was not just the superior reasoning of Grok 4, but in fact the introduction of the AI companion avatars, which included not safe for work options. The number 3 trend that Andreessen identifies is about the rise of China. Now, the interesting thing that they explore is to what extent their placement on this list reflects the China market just being large and not having access to the Western models versus China actually infiltrating the Western models. They do note that number 9, Quark, which is Alibaba's AI assistant, number 12, Dubao, which is ByteDance's LLM, and number 17, Kimi, all saw more than 75% of their traffic coming from China. However, they also noted that many entrants on this list are, as they put it, developed in China but now exported globally, with the vast majority of their usage in other countries. They even pointed out that some of the so-called Chinese tools are blocked in China. They specifically note video models. Chinese video models in particular have tended to have an advantage over Western developed models, both because there are more researchers focused on video in China, and there are fewer IP regulations with likely training on copyrighted data. VO3 was the first US model to break this trend, which is partially trained on YouTube data. Now, maybe most interesting is that 22 of the 50 apps on the mobile charts were developed in China, although only 3 of those 22 are primarily used in China. One of the big differences between web and mobile is that there's still in the mobile apps chart a huge concentration around discrete specific AI applications that interact with mobile native features like the camera. For example, Me Too all on its own had 5 entries on the list, including their photo and video editor, Beauty Plus, Beauty Cam, Wink, and Airbrush. Next trend from A16Z, which is certainly one that stood out to me as well, is that if in the last edition we saw the early emergence of vibe coding, it has now come on as a full force. Bolt has actually fallen now. Remember, it had just snuck on the list at 48 before, but it is now on the brink list, just missing the cut, while both Lovable and Replit surged onto the main list. The top 4 vibe coding apps are now getting over 50 million monthly web visits all combined. Interestingly, A16Z also looked at data from credit card panel provider Consumer Edge and showed that vibe coding platforms are seeing much stronger revenue retention than some might have imagined. In other words, it appears that people aren't just trying these things out once and then abandoning them. In many cases, in fact, they're growing their monthly spend in the several months following their first usage. As the platforms get more mature and people are building more sophisticated things, you're also seeing a division between web visits that are going to the core application versus web visits that are going to sites where things built on those apps are housed. In other words, both Lovable and Replit have their primary URLs, lovable.dev and replit.com, where people go to sign in to actually use the vibe coding tools. But then if they publish an application that's going to live on lovable.app or replit.app, unless of course they use their own domain, both lovable.app and replit.app are starting to see some meaningful traffic. Replit.app applications are somewhere around 2 to 3 million monthly visitors, and lovable.app creations are up over 10 million. Overall, Lovable is 23 on the web list and Replit is 41. It will surprise you not at all to learn that I think that this is going to be an area that just continues to see massive growth. I would be shocked if either Lovable or Replit aren't in the top 20 6 months from now the next time A16Z looks at this. The last note, going with this theme of stabilization, is that Andreessen identifies that there are 14 companies now who have appeared every time on all 5 iterations of their web top 50. They write, "These companies represent a true cross-section of consumer behavior with AI. General assistance like ChatGPT, Perplexity, and Poe, companionship like Character AI, image generation with Midjourney and Leonardo, image and video editing with Veed and Cutout, voice generation with 11 Labs, productivity tools with PhotoRoom, Gamma, and Quillbot, and model hosting with Savit AI and Hugging Face." Overall, like I said, it feels to me like we're starting to see a settling in these lists. There still is a little bit more noise and chaos, I think, in the mobile apps, which makes sense given how much discovery happens just based on app stores. But especially when you look at the web list, you're really starting to see what you would imagine to be the core themes start to emerge and really assert themselves. General purpose LLMs are near the top, vibe coding tools are on the rise, companionship apps continue to make an appearance, media-based productivity tools continue to be strong. And if there is one thing that I think is worth putting a finger on to watch for the future, it's the entry at number 31 of Manus. As far as I can tell looking over this list, Manus is the only pure-play general agent platform on the list. Now, we've talked a lot on this show about to what extent agents are going to come online in a general form versus a very specific or vertical form. The fact that Manus is all the way up there at 31 suggests that there might be room or at least interest in a general purpose agent, and even outside of the core foundation model companies. So when we come back in 6 months, that is one that I think will be worth checking back in on. Will Manus be higher? Will there be other general purpose agents on the list? Will Google have moved, for example, Project Mariner out of labs into its own space? All questions for the future, but for now, that is going to do it for today's AI Daily Brief. Appreciate you listening or watching as always, and until next time, peace